Well, the time is gone 8 minutes past 8 as we kick off this morning, taking a look at this increase in South African CPI. And we're going straight across to join Professor at the University of Johannesburg in the Department of Sociology, Professor Patrick Bond. Patrick, good morning to you. As always, welcome to the show.
Assalamu alaikum. It's very good to be back with you. Thanks a lot, Inaya.
Yes, Patrick, are we surprised? Because I see some reports have it a shocking 0.7% increase in CPI inflation.
Well, it comes across as surprising only if we're not watching the rand to dollar, because we do import too many things that we should be making locally. And because the rand has fallen over 10% in January and into early February, that was one of the main reasons that the knock-on of having imported prices, including of grains and some of the other foodstuffs we import. But those 14% increases we're just seeing year on year in the food prices without a drought condition, these are very disturbing, because usually the food market can be can quell the rest of the consumer bundle. But of course, we've got this added dilemma for food producers, for restaurants, for anyone handling anything to do with the agricultural value chain, which is the terrible degree of load shedding that then increase prices if you have to buy diesel or petrol, if you have to slow down your production process. And I think that's probably the main driving force. We can blame it on Eskom. I would never stop blaming it, though, on the world market. Although the food prices globally are a little bit lower this month than last, we still have the problem of grain from Ukraine. It's much, much lower than it was because of Vladimir Putin's invasion, and that has wreaked havoc with energy, but also with food prices.
Yes. Now, we've seen basics, Patrick, bread, for instance. We're talking about cereal. We're talking about just the food inflation alone, 13.6% year on year. Now, this has been the highest in 14 years.
Mm-hmm. And it's actually led not only by some of the grains, especially maize meal up 35% year on year, but also onions, samp, paraffin, washing powder, ice cream, bread flour, cake flour, corned beef, and savory biscuits. Those are all in the category of regular consumption by ordinary working class and poor people. And the prices are all in the range of 23 to, in the case of onions, 44%. So we are looking at several of the things that, really should be produced locally with inexpensive inputs. Our labor costs haven't been rising. And it's, as I say, I think a function of Eskom. To the extent there are imported parts of these products, the declining rand is a problem. So if you're thinking about the policy, if you're orthodox, and you especially have just seen the Federal Reserve raise its interest rates 0.25%, even after three major banks collapsed. In fact, two of the three biggest bank collapses in United States history in dollar terms, $300 billion worth of bank collapses in just two banks from Silicon Valley and New York. Ironically, although the Fed should be lowering interest rates and stimulating growth, it's doing the opposite now. Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, is very orthodox. And unfortunately, we have a very, very orthodox Reserve Bank. The SARB, the SARB, the South African Reserve Bank, is very likely in about 10 days' time, when maybe it'll be in fact 7 days' time, they meet at the Monetary Policy Committee to raise our interest rates yet again to combat inflation. Even though we can very confidently say that by raising the rates, you're simply lowering the demand, and that demand problem, in other words, higher wages that might push up prices, isn't actually a problem here. And it's not even a problem in the US. So we're really looking at the mistaken analyses and prescriptions of orthodox central bankers. It makes one wish to have the Islamic financing where there's not an interest rate. Interest rate is usury in some other classical Islamic banking systems. So we are going to be suffering even more next Thursday with the Monetary Policy Committee, probably increasing our interest rates 0.25% because of these new inflation figures.
Also, Patrick, the question is, why is there not a concerted effort to grow food locally, to manufacture food locally, instead of placing so much reliance on imports? It's not that we don't have the capacity in this country not to manufacture our own food.
It's a major problem across all of our imports. I was just in the shop and I picked up some toothpicks. What do you think the toothpick container said? Made in China. So we've got a dilemma of not just excessive food imports in some areas, including grains, but also the import of many products that if we had a sensible import substitution policy. Now, it's something that Ibrahim Patel, our trade and industry minister, has often promised, but no, he's very weak on maybe really providing the sort of protection, which would include tariff protection on imports. And that in turn would spike some inflation initially until we could catch up with local production. But it also would violate some of the World Trade Organization rules that Patel has, unfortunately, and his predecessor, Rob Davies, signed on to. So I would love your argument to be more general common sense. It should be. Even John Maynard Keynes, the capitalist economist of the 20th century, who was best known, he said, there are certain things that of their nature should be international: travel, hospitality, and ideas. But when it is reasonably and conveniently possible, let goods be homespun, and above all, let finance be national. And the two things he's suggesting in that quote, which I often cite, 1933, Yale Review, a very important article by John Maynard Keynes. The two things he's suggesting, which is that we should internationalize people, runs up against the xenophobic tendencies in the government and in society. But the critical thing is that we need to have more sovereignty, state sovereignty and protection for these struggling local producers. And we've lost so much, haven't we? Clothing and textiles and appliances and electronics and footwear and so many industries that were producing at about 24% of GDP back in 1990. And with the World Trade Organization and the government's sort of free market policies, we lost about half of that manufacturing output, and most of those labor-intensive sectors with the jobs there gone. Building them back isn't impossible. Many countries have done so. And a deglobalization or localization, especially, there's new technologies like 3D printing, which allow what used to be made in China mass production scale to be made more conveniently in smaller production runs here. And I'm hoping some of that, the logic, the policy logic, and maybe the technology will allow us to do exactly what you're suggesting: import substitution.
Well, the scary thought would be food shortages, Patrick, as well, because we know from seeing what's been taking place in Europe, we've seen it in the UK in particular, where rationing of the sale of basic foodstuffs, onions, cucumbers, these type of products where you can only buy one or two at a time. And this is a scary thought. Would we be in the same position as the UK in years to come?
Well, we might be, because the dilemma of how global value chains come under stress has been revealed again and again with COVID and with various accidents. Remember, there was in the Suez Canal a big container ship, the Ever Given, that just got stuck, and much of the world trading system that runs through that area was just completely disrupted for nearly 2 weeks. And those are the sorts of, let's call them, supply chain breakdowns and the constraints in having too much reliance on these international networks. There will be another addition to our shortage problem at some point, and that is that taxes on the long distance of shipping and also air flights will begin to kick in, and that will also begin to, I'd say, slow down international trade. Now, that may not be a bad thing if we can do the import substitution, but in the meantime, what we are also picking up now is so much tension and pressure in societies, and the general attack on standards of living. For example, in France, the attack on the pensioners, who now are expected to work 2 more years, and they've been protesting at a record rate and nearly overthrew Emmanuel Macron a couple of days ago in a no confidence vote. But also next door in Mozambique, the desperation in the streets when a young rapper critical of the government died and the police clamped down on the funeral. Massive protests. We could go up to Kenya, where there's electoral protests, or in Senegal and Nigeria, again, electoral-based protests. In Tunisia, a dictator with quite a racist attitude, also under mass protests. So we're looking kind of all around the world, and certainly in Africa, where there are vulnerable countries and pressure, and maybe an electoral excuse, or in our case on Monday, a stay-away call. there's a lot of anger in the streets, right? And I think a food riot, which is something that was very, very common, especially in 2007 and 8 when food prices spiked to levels they are now. That's the kind of thing that it really takes good, mature political judgment to figure out how to harness and how to take that anger and make it into something that can be constructive and change public policy and lower interest rates, not raise them, and put on exchange controls to keep the money in the country and give food subsidies. Those are the sort of strong public policy calls that I think more of the activists are beginning to make, because they're worried about not just food sovereignty and potential shortages and the high prices, but they're worried about the general direction of the society under basically a pro-corporate free market government.
Well, Patrick, there is serious cause for concern. And finally, talking about Africa, and we know the potential in Africa. South Africa is not unique to this, where many parts of Africa have the potential of being the bread baskets, not only for the African continent, but the rest of the world. And that is the potential we have on this continent, which is not fully exploited and utilized to its maximum.
Yes, and the dilemma, of course, is that with the climate crisis already very, very powerfully affecting food production in the Horn of Africa, especially Somalia. I was reading that about 43,000 excess deaths over prior droughts have occurred, about half of those children in just the last year. And that's, again, part and parcel of our changing weather patterns that South African industry and mining and smelting and the coal-fired power plants all have a big contribution to. So I think owning up to our own climate debt and making sure we can get the irrigation systems to small farmers that the old white Afrikaner farmer always enjoyed. They had cheap credit from the Reserve Bank and from the banks directly, and then they had systems to avoid the harsh penalties of climate crisis, where there are drought conditions and you need some irrigation, you need to pump some groundwater. And our new government, even though these are black small farmers who are most vulnerable, has not really begun to do adaptation. And we've seen that in the cities with the lack of stormwater drainage, with the ill-equipped sewage systems that break down and poison even the beaches of Durban. And all of these things do remind us food, maybe as centrally as anything else, along with water, that we're not yet climate proofed. And that's something that for the continent and for our ordinary working class person should be more and more a part of our demands. The reason I say that is partly because the North is finally recognizing that they owe what's called loss and damage. In Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, last November, they admitted that this climate crisis would have such terrible impacts, say, on food production or on infrastructure and people's lives. 500 lost in Cyclone Freddy a few days ago, 500 lost a year ago in the rain bombs that hit Durban. And as a result, the North, or people who pollute, and that includes me, people who have high emissions, really have to start paying a bill. And our government yet is to recognize that. And unfortunately is still powering ahead with ideas of offshore gas and oil and gas-fired power plants for Eskom and more coal exports. So it's still a tragedy that we've got an economy and a ruling elite still addicted to fossil fuels.
Well, Prof, we're going to have to leave it at that. As always, we do appreciate you taking time out and talking to us right here on Salam Media. We wish you all the best and please take care.
Thank you, Inayat. Good to be with you.
Professor Patrick Bond with us this morning, professor at the University of Johannesburg in the Department of Sociology, unpacking the CPI increase amongst many other issues that are extremely relevant. The time is just gone 8:22. We're going to go for a break, and we will be focusing on the protection of journalists. And the question that is being asked is, should governments do more to protect journalists?